Everybody makes mistakes when they're learning a new technology. Whether you're learning SQL or Python or whatever it may be, even the Power Platform, you are going to make mistakes when you're new to a technology. And so in this video, we're going to discuss what are the top 5 mistakes that beginners make whenever they're starting with Power Automate. Let's get started. Now, the number one mistake that people make when they're getting started with Power Automate is that they don't use solutions. First of all, what is a solution? Why should you be using solutions? Let's cover all of that. Solutions are going to be helpful because they can help make your work that you do in Power Automate portable. So solutions make it easier to move flows and their components between different environments. They help support better application lifecycle management practices, and they help ensure that you're kind of keeping track and managing effectively the different items that you create when you're working with inside of Power Automate. And this can help facilitate better and easier movement between a dev, test, and production environment. Solutions also help in organizing and managing large numbers of flows. Without solutions, all of your flows that you design are just kind of put within inside of your environment, and they're dumped in one place without any logical organization to them. Solutions are also going to be helpful because they can help group other kinds of Microsoft services together. So while you're working with inside of Power Automate, and you can have flows in your solution, you can also have things like Power Apps, Dataverse tables, Copilot Studio solutions, even Power BI solutions can be integrated into what you've designed with inside of a solution. So what we're going to show you is how solutions can be helpful. We're going to talk about what solutions are, but let's show you first how you can create a solution. So we're going to go to our demo and check it out. All right, so we are inside of the Power Automate environment, and what I'd like to do is we're going to go navigate over to the left-hand side where you can find solutions. Inside of the solutions section, you can see I can have a few solutions that I've already previously created, but we're going to create a new solution from the ground up. So we're going to go up to new solution. All right, now as you go to create a new solution, a couple best practices here for you is you probably want to have some kind of naming convention when it comes to solutions to make sure it's really clear on what kind of information is stored in a solution. So there's a lot of different strategies as far as what kind of information and how to break up solutions, but a lot of individuals or a lot of organizations will break them down by department and maybe even by use case. So for example, you may put some kind of prefix to your solutions like HR or finance or IT to identify what department is using the information or using the files that are inside of the solution. Generally, I would start with some kind of an abbreviation over here where you see display name. I'd start with some kind of abbreviation of what the solution name is or what kind of department. Let's say we're working with inside of HR here. I can type in HR, or if I'm in finance, maybe you do FIN, or you can spell the whole thing out if you want. And then you want to have some kind of descriptor, something that describes what the process is that is being solved with inside of the solution. So if you wanted to here, you could say something like invoice processing. So I could say something like this. And then you could, even if you wanted to, at the end of it, you could put like a version number. So if you wanted to identify the version number that you're using with inside of this, you could put like V1 or really anything you want at the end of it. Now you'll also notice that this name below is a little bit different. You have a display name and then there's a logical name behind the scenes. That's what's kind of stored behind the scenes to provide your name. You'll notice you're not allowed to have spaces in the logical names here. You'll also find below that you can create a publisher. Now, if you're not familiar with what a publisher is, this is where you can have a label or a tag that creates an identity of who made or owns the components within inside of your solutions. The flows, the apps, the connectors, they're all stored within inside of here. You can think of the publisher as a way to organize and keep track of those individual items that are created. So if you create tables, for example, those tables will have a prefix with the publisher. So you can create, for instance, like a human resources publisher to make sure it's really clear that all of the items that were created with this publisher are related to human resources. When you select new publisher, you also have the ability to identify a contact. We're not going to do that in this scenario, but notice that this is basically who do you go to whenever there's a problem with one of the items that are identified or stored with this publisher as the tag that's primarily identified here. So we're going to go ahead and name the publisher. We'll call this one Human Resources. We're going to purposely make some mistakes here just to show you what you can run into as you're creating a publisher. You don't necessarily need a new publisher for every solution. You're going to primarily do this when you have like-minded or like-similar projects that you're working on. I've given a display name, a logical name. Whenever I go to save this, we're going to get a little error message that pops up. So what it's letting us know is that only characters that are ranged A to Z, basically it's telling us here we can't have spaces within inside of our publishers here. You also have to have unique names, so you can't have more than one publisher with the same name. So it's kind of telling us to come in and remove some of the key things that we have here. I'm going to go ahead and remove the spaces both on the logical name as well as the other name we have here as well, and then hit save. So this will create the publisher for us. Once the publisher is created, then we're able to continue continue forward and we can create this solution. So we can actually select our publisher here now. You can see our human resources publisher is now available, and then we can select create. Now that final step is actually going to create our solution, and then we can start to add items into the solution. You can either create new flows from within inside of the solution itself. So you can create cloud flows instantly here. I can create different ones with different triggers immediately, or you can add existing flows. Again, the whole point of this video is to help guide you for some of the more common mistakes that you make as a beginner. One of the common mistakes is not using solutions. So what you can do here is if you started off by creating flows without a solution, you can come and add them into your solution later if you needed to. So if you made the mistake, don't worry, you can fix it now. So again, the best practice there is to use solutions. It helps you to have containers. It helps you to make this portable where you can move it between environments very easily. All right, now let's talk about mistake number 2. Mistake number 2 is that you should have proper naming conventions within inside of your flows to help document your flows. Not only the names of the flows themselves, but also the actions that you create within inside of the flows. You should be encouraged to use proper naming conventions for multiple reasons, really. It can be incredibly helpful regardless of the technology you're working with to leverage proper naming conventions. And this is true also with inside of Power Automate. You saw a few moments ago that you should think about naming conventions when it comes to solutions, but again, you should also think about naming conventions when it comes to the flows that you design, the triggers, and the actions that you use as well. So why should you think about naming conventions? Well, for a couple reasons. One, collaboration. When working in a team, having a standardization for naming conventions and documentation ensures that everyone is on the same page. So when somebody comes in and looks at a flow that you designed a long time ago, they'll be able to very clearly see what your flow is doing. It could also save you time in the long run. So I just mentioned it a moment ago, but proper documentation and naming conventions saves time in the long run. You won't have to spend extra time figuring out what each part of your flow does because you properly named things. And you can look just at a glance and figure out what that flow was actually doing. So it can speed up development, it can speed up troubleshooting, and really reduce frustration. It's also really helpful for knowledge transfer. So if you leave a project or you leave the organization that you happen to be working for right now, well-documented flows and clear naming conventions make it easier for others to take over and continue the work without significant downtime. These are some of the reasons why you should consider proper naming conventions as you build your flow. Don't just go with the standard names that are provided. All right, so let's jump into a demo and show you exactly what I mean by naming conventions. All right, so we're inside the solution that we talked about in our first step, and if we were to create a new flow, we should be thinking about naming conventions even from the very beginning of our flow design. So we're gonna go and create a new automated cloud flow, and we'll just do an instant one for the sake of brevity here. And we're gonna go ahead and start by naming our flow. Now, it's really not so important that you follow my naming convention. It's more important that you have a naming convention at your organization and that everybody follows it. So if you don't like my naming convention I'm gonna show you here, no problem. It's just more important that you have one from the beginning. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and name this flow, and I'm gonna call this based on some kind of descriptor of what it's doing. So let's say, for example, this flow is designed to email my finance team whenever there's a new invoice that comes in, and then I wanna log that into Dataverse. So I could call this flow something like email alerts. And then I'm gonna separate it with underscores. By the way, I'm using camel casing here. You can find there's some documentation that actually Microsoft has some best practices guides around naming conventions, and they'll kind of guide you through using camel cases or underscores in between words that you have. But I'm gonna have some kind of name that identifies what it does. So it has an email alert. And then what are we connecting into? What kind of information are we alerting? Well, we're alerting based on new invoices. And then where are we storing that information? Inside of Dataverse. So I wanna have something that's really descriptive here so it's clear on what's being done within side of the flow. You can then select whatever kind of trigger you're going to use. I'll go ahead and do a manual one for the time being and hit create, and then that will create our flow. So in my case here, you'll see the first name identifies the end result of the flow, email alert. The reason for that is I found that when a flow is failing, I often remember what the flow is based on what the end result is. So if the end result is to have an email alert, then it's helpful to have that in the beginning part of the name. So that way I can really clearly see where to go find that particular flow that's erroring out. Then new invoice identifies the key information the flow is returning, and then Dataverse identifies where the data may be coming from or where I'm sending it to, whatever it may be. Now, when it comes to the flows you design, let's actually go to one that's already partially built here. I have a flow that's already partially built, and we'll go ahead and go into edit mode here. You should also consider naming conventions within inside of the individual actions and tasks that you do as well. So as you go through individual flows that you've designed, you should consider naming them in a proper way so it's really clear to be able to find what those flows are doing long term. Whether whether you're using the new designer or the old designer, you can rename each of these items. So for example, where it says get items within inside of this flow, I would likely want to select this and give it a proper name. This name is not a very efficient name. It's not a good name for me to be able to come and figure out what exactly this is doing. I also recommend, this is a little bit of a bonus here, I also recommend adding a note to give additional documentation as well. So where you find the add a note button here, that'll allow you to actually write full sentences that can be stored within inside of your flow to give additional documentation as well. All right, but inside of the actual item here, we can go through, you can of course see the settings here, but what I really want to do is rename it up at the top. So while this one is called get items, I would want to be really specific on what kind of items it's getting. So if I look underneath the parameters, I can see that the list that it's pulling from is status report. So I would likely come up to the get items section, and I like to do it this way where I add a little hyphen and add that I'm going to get items from the status report SharePoint list. All right, so there at a very quick glance, I can see exactly where that information is coming from. I'm getting items. It has a SharePoint icon there, so I know it's SharePoint, but it's getting items from my status report list. But you can continue to do this through other parts of your flow as well. That includes your trigger, that includes your loops, that includes other things you have like this compose. So while this compose seems like it's just returning back title, I would still go up to the compose and say something like return title. Something like that, so it's really clear on what you're doing. And again, also you can always add notes. You can select add a note, and then you can write full sentences here to make it super clear on what is happening with inside of this flow. The main thing you're trying to avoid is that when someone else comes in after you, maybe even yourself, that you will know exactly what this flow is doing, and you don't have to spend 15, 20 minutes trying to debug and remember something that you designed perhaps months or even years ago. With notes, with proper naming, you'll be able to save yourself loads of time. Now, as I mentioned, if your organization has their own naming conventions that are different, that's totally okay. The important thing really is that your organization has some kind of standard and that you're following it. Documentation of your naming conventions and a style guide or documentation in any way ensures that all your team members are aware of the standards to follow. And that promotes kind of uniformity and reduces the likeliness of inconsistencies and misunderstandings within your flow design. So naming convention, proper documentation, super important within inside of your flows. Let me know if you have a different standard. If you have a different standard that you like to share with others, put it in the comments below. Let me know what kind of naming conventions your company has, or heaven forbid, hopefully your company has some naming convention that you're following. Heaven forbid that they don't have one at all, but let me know what kind of standards that you have around naming conventions, because that's a hotly debated topic. How should I name things? It's something that, while it seems small, it's super important to consider. All right, for our next mistake, we're gonna talk about trigger conditions. Now, if you're new to Power Automate, trigger conditions may be something totally foreign to you, and that's okay. We're gonna talk about what they are and why they're important to use. All right, so many flows that I see are designed with triggers that run when a new row is added to a table or a list, and then immediately following the trigger is some kind of condition to filter out the rows you don't care about. Instead, you can leverage trigger conditions to optimize your design. So why are trigger conditions helpful? Well, they help improve efficiency. By setting specific conditions, you can ensure that flows only run when necessary, and that saves resources and reduces unnecessary flow executions. It also helps with precision. So trigger conditions helps you target specific scenarios, ensuring that your flow responds only to relevant changes or events. It can also help performance, limiting the number of times a flow runs, and can improve overall performance in general, especially environments with large data sets or frequent updates to the data. It also can help with cost savings. Reducing the number of flow runs can help manage costs, particularly if you are on a plan, a Power Automate plan, with a limited number of runs per month. All right, so let's jump into a demonstration and show you how you can set up a trigger condition. So I have a flow on my screen already, ready to go. This is a different flow from our last example, but inside of this flow, I have a SharePoint trigger, and it's looking for whenever a new item is created in this SharePoint list, this spending tracker SharePoint list. Now, the first thing that I want to do whenever I have this flow run is I want to split it out and filter the data, and I'm going to filter the data based on if there is any payment types of the value credits. Imagine this, I have hundreds or even thousands of records that are coming through this SharePoint list, and some of them I have are payment types of cash, sometimes I have payment types of debit, sometimes I have payment types of credit, and I want to be able to filter those results when the flow runs. Now, right now, the way that this flow is designed, it's going to run every time a new row is added, and then it's going to do a filter after the fact. What trigger conditions do instead is it will actually apply that filter before the flow even runs. So it will only run the flow flow whenever there is a certain criteria met. So let's say, for example, I only want this flow to even bother to run if the payment type is credit. Again, right now it flows no matter what the payment type is, and then it does a filter later on. I want to filter before the flow even runs. How can you do that? I recommend actually adding an action below your trigger to be able to generate the Power Automate expression to properly filter your data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the action adder here, and I'm going to add in a new action, and I'm just going to use a compose action here. All right, compose is great for doing some troubleshooting. That's kind of what we're using it for here. In this case, we're actually going to use it to be able to write an expression. We can then get rid of the compose after the fact, but we're going to use it to help write a Power Automate expression here for us. And what I want to do is I want to say, hey, whenever the payment type equals credit, then I want to send it through my trigger condition to filter out anything that's not credit. All right, so what we can do is you can write an expression here. You can launch the expression editor here, and you can call on dynamic content. You can also write functions here. You're going to use the equals function right here, and then we're going to tell it that we want to check and see when the payment type column, which is going to be underneath our dynamic content, when our payment type column right here, payment type value, when it is equal to credit, so we're going to type in the word credit here. When it's equal to credit, then we want to only return back those particular values. So again, the reason why I did this compose statement or this compose action is really just to write this expression for me. Once you have that expression written, you can delete it. So I'm going to copy this and use this within inside of our trigger condition. So I'm done with this. I'll close this out. I'll even delete this here. I don't need it anymore. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go into our trigger. So I'll select my trigger, and then inside the settings of the trigger right here, this is the area where we can add in a trigger condition. You'll find that area right here. So if we select trigger condition to add one, we can then paste in our expression that we have right there. And what you may have to do, you'll notice I have an @ sign in the beginning. I actually kind of pre-added that ahead of time. You may need to add in that little @ sign at the beginning to be able to use this in the trigger condition section. If you don't add that @ sign in the very beginning, it will not work. So you do need to add that in. But once you have that added, you should be good to go. And what this means is it's only going to run this flow for payment types that are equal to credit. If one comes in that says debit or cash, the flow will not even run. So this now does the filtering at the trigger level rather than later on throughout the flow. So we can make sure that we only run this flow whenever it's actually needed. All right, number 4 on our list for mistakes that are common for beginners with inside of Power Automate is considering concurrency. Think about concurrency with inside the flows that you design, because what concurrency allows is for parallel executions within inside of various loops, like a for each loop. By default, a for each loop runs sequentially, which can be time consuming when handling large data sets. So why is concurrency good? Well, for faster processing. By enabling concurrency, multiple items can be processed simultaneously, significantly reducing the overall time required to complete your flow and complete your loops that you have. It can also help with scalability. So with the ability to set the degree of parallelism anywhere between 1 to 50, you can scale the processing power according to the needs of your workflow, ensuring optimized performance. So definitely something to consider. Hang tight though, because we're going to also talk about some downsides of concurrency as well. So let's first look at how you can set it up and enable it with inside of a demonstration, and then we'll walk you through things you need to consider after the fact. All right, so we have another flow open on our screen here. Let's take a look. This particular flow does have an apply to each loop that's part of it, and this loop could go over a number of times the various items that we have from our source that we're working with. We're working with a SharePoint list. Did not use proper naming conventions, you can see here, as we should, but all of the items are going to be brought into this loop, and it's looping over each item that's inside of a SharePoint list. There could be hundreds or thousands of values within inside of that SharePoint list. So think about what happens by default. An apply to each loop is going to loop over each one of those records one by one by one, and it's only going to go to the next one after the previous one is completed. So one of the things that you can do is you can actually change the parallelism and the concurrency settings within inside of your loops. So if I were to select this loop here, for example, you can see inside the settings of the apply to each loop, there are some options to control the concurrency settings. If I turn on the concurrency settings, you can see the degree of parallelism can be adjusted anywhere between 1 to 50 degrees of parallelism. What that essentially means is you can have up to 50 different iterations of that loop happening at the same time. So that loop can run 50 different values and process 50 different records all at the same time, or you can adjust it down a little bit. You don't have to necessarily use all 50 parallel processing here if you don't need it. Now, there are some downsides to concurrency concurrency that you should consider as well. Resource contention is one of the things you should consider. Running multiple tasks simultaneously can lead to competition for system resources such as CPU and memory, which might slow down other processes or workflows running at the same time or on the same system. So that's something to consider as well. There is a point of diminishing return where having too many parallel processes actually ends up not speeding things up, or it could even slow things down because you bog down your machine so much. Another thing to consider is data integrity issues. If multiple tasks are updating the same data source concurrently, there is a risk of data conflicts or inconsistencies. Proper locking mechanisms or conflict resolution strategies need to be in place to maintain data integrity. So those are all things to be thinking about as well. Increased debugging difficulty can also be a problem. So debugging concurrent processes can be more challenging compared to sequential ones. Issues such as, contention or deadlock can kind of arise in there, which are often hard to diagnose and fix when you have these processes going in parallel. You could also have potential for overloading system. We talked about that a little bit, that kind of law of diminishing return. You could have too many things running at the same time where you're just not getting the improved performance that you would hope for. So those are all things that you should consider as you are working through these flows. So you should increase the number of parallel runs to a point where you get benefit from it, but not to a point where you start to bog down your machine that you're loading into. So think about those things. You should also consider things like licensing and quotas as well. Depending on your Power Automate plan, there might be limits to the number of concurrent runs or the total number of runs per month. So exceeding those limits could result in additional costs or even throttling of the flows that you have. So these are all things that you really should consider. Now, a couple things that I want to make sure I highlight here at this point. There is a Power Automate best practices guide. We're going to put a link to that inside the description of this video. Make sure you take a look at that. That talks about some of those things that you should think about when it comes to concurrency, and also take a look at our Power Automate cheat sheet, where we talk about different design patterns within inside of Power Automate that you should be considering. We're going to have links to both of those within inside this video description, so make sure you take a look at those. The number 5 mistake that beginners make within inside of Power Automate is lack of error handling. Error handling, of course, in any tool is important to do, but implementing error handling within inside of Power Automate is crucial for maintaining reliability and robustness of your Power Automate workflows. So why is it so important? Ensures continuity, right? Proper error handling helps maintain the flow of automated processes and prevents disruptions that could halt operations. You might have a lot kind of riding on these flows running. So if there's some kind of error that happens, what does that mean for the rest of your business? Also, you can use it for improving reliability. So you want to improve the reliability of the flows that you design by catching and managing errors so that you can ensure that the flows consistently run as expected. An important note, flows will automatically be turned off if a flow continuously fails for 14 days. So if you have a flow that continuously fails every time it runs for 14 days, the flows will then be turned off automatically. Now, you're usually notified when that happens, but it's important to know about that because that's one of the reasons why you want to build in that error handling within inside of your flows. All right, so let's take a look at how we can do a couple different ideas around error handling in your flows. All right, so I have open again a flow that we looked at previously, but we're going to look at different ways that you can do error handling in this flow very briefly. I'm also going to share again the recommendation to look at the best practices guide for Power Automate, link in the description, because there's several more advanced techniques for dealing with error handling there. So if you're looking at something like, hey, I want to email myself error messages as well as links to the flows that have errors, there's some guidance within inside of the best practices guide in the description of this video by Microsoft to give you more information on how to handle things like that. But let's look at some of the simple things we can do, at least in this example. Let's jump into it. All right, so this flow you can see has a demonstration or has something we looked at earlier. It has a condition in it, but the main thing that I want to get across here is whenever you look at any one of these actions and you right click on them, by right clicking on the flow action, you'll see there's an option here called Run After. Run After allows you to determine what happens when the flow fails, what happens when the flow runs successfully, and I keep saying flow, but it's really this specific action. So what happens when this specific action succeeds, what happens when this specific action fails, and you can determine how you want to route things based on that. So if I select the Run After, again, you right click on the action and select Run After, you'll see there's a section underneath the settings, if you scroll down, called Run After. And in the Run After section here, you can expand it and you can say, hey, I want the flow to continue even if it has a failure on this action. You can turn on all of these if you want to, and you'll notice the little color indicators shown within inside the flow, letting you know that you have made a change to what happens to the Run After settings. But right now, the default behavior is it's only going to continue on to the next action if the previous one, that being the compose, is successful. So even though I right clicked on the Get Manager action, it's really referring to what's going to happen if the action above it is successful or fails or is timed out. So you can check any of these items that you want, and what this means is if the compose action before this fails, it's gonna run the next action anyways. That's what those different items mean. Maybe I'm gonna make it here is if the compose action is successful or if it fails, I wanna continue forward anyways. You can set that up here by using these different checkboxes. So the run after is one of the ways that you can do some error handling. As I mentioned, there's other things within inside of the best practices guide I certainly recommend looking at for more advanced error handling. One other technique that I wanna share with you as well is using scope within inside of your flow. Now, many people use scope as a container to hold multiple items, and it's really good at this, but it can also be used for applying error handling within inside of a group of actions rather than just individual ones. So in theory, you could say if anything within inside of a scope fails, then I want to send an email notifying someone of the error within any action. If you've used scope before, great. If you haven't, let's take a peek at it very briefly. Back within inside of our flow design here, I'm gonna add a scope by selecting the add step here, and we'll add an action, and I'm gonna type in scope. Now, scope is great for multiple reasons. It's basically a container that can hold other actions inside of it, and you can use it for a lot of things, but one of the things we can also say is if we bring in this condition, you'll notice all of the items within inside of the condition came along for the ride as well, but this is basically allowing us to maybe add an action after the scope. So let's add an action right after it, maybe a simple compose just so we can test things out. There we go. And what I can do now is I can add a run after setting on this compose, and what that will essentially mean is if any item within inside of this scope fails, it doesn't matter which one it is, if any of the items fails, then I want to go ahead and continue forward as well. So the point being, scope allows you to set this run after setting at a higher level rather than at an individual action level. You can say if anything within inside the scope fails, then continue forward. So another way of leveraging scope, I highly recommend that you explore scope because there's some really, really cool things you can do with it. Again, check out that best practices guide. There's lots of really neat things for things like try-catch design patterns, as well as being able to use things like the workflow Power Automate functions. The workflow functions within inside of Power Automate allow you to derive some detailed information about the flow, like the flow ID and a few other things, and you can kind of generate this unique link that you can email yourself whenever a flow fails. So lots of good stuff to check out in that best practices guide. Also check out the Power Automate cheat sheet in the description as well. All right, I know this was the top 5 mistakes that beginners make within inside of Power Automate, but I'm gonna give you a bonus mistake, and this is a simple one. I won't even need to do a demonstration of this. This one is around diagramming your workflows first. So what a lot of beginners make a mistake of is whenever they jump into Power Automate, they're new to learning it, they'll jump straight into the Power Automate designer and they'll start dragging actions and triggers and trying to experiment and try and figure things out all within inside of the editor. And that's fine, but a best practice that I can share with you as well is before you jump into the designer, go grab a piece of paper or go to a whiteboard and draw out what you think the flow should do first. By drawing out the flow, you will think through the design and the pattern of what you're trying to do before you get lost with inside of this tool that you're brand new to learning. So diagramming and thinking through things ahead of time can be extremely helpful. I even do it as someone that's not a beginner with Power Automate anymore, and it helps me think through the process. It helps me think through all of the different nitty-gritty details that are important with inside of your flow design that you might very well forget as you start to drag different actions in the designer. Now, I hope this video was helpful. Don't forget to make sure you check out our on-demand learning, and if you are interested, you can always sign up for a trial where you can explore some of our Power Automate classes. We have beginner and advanced Power Automate classes. We have classes on desktop flows as well as cloud flows, so lots of things for you to explore. I want to thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot.